Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the War of the Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Neil Icon from finally sunny and non-snowy North Germany. I'm totally jet-lagged, having just early as this week come back from the US. But I'm super excited for today's recording because I have a amazing guest on an amazing topic that I always like to talk about and explore more. And that is, and I hope I'm going to do this again as good as we did it in the
Good. It's gonna be
pre-recording
good.
section, Isadora Moura Mota. And her book is Freedom's Horizon, Black Abolitionism in 19th-Century Brazil, which came out with the University of Pennsylvania Press. Isadora is a assistant professor. Hasn't changed yet, I suppose.
Not yet.
Okay. Assistant professor
Getting
of
there.
history at Princeton University in New Jersey, with a PhD from Brown. And you have also a master's degree from the State University of Campinas in Sao Paulo. So we're going to see the Brazilian connection here really well. So first of all, thank you so much for joining me today, Isadora, for the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And so I always am looking out for topics on Latin America because it's, especially in the English language, still such a underexplored and not much written about topic area. So I'm going to assume that you are Brazilian. And
Yes.
this is a bit of a home topic for you. So, but how did you come to say that I want to write about Brazilian slavery for a American audience? It is.
True. So yeah, I am Brazilian. I was born and raised in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And then I moved to the US, I think more or less 20 years ago. And have been here, since then, and did my PhD here and started to teach here. But I think the book, in some ways, the book connects to my own experience as someone that lives between Brazil and the US. But the book itself was born from my experience of researching slave rebellions in 19th century Brazil when I was still in Brazil. And that's what kind of inspired me, was this experience of research in the Brazilian National Archives. That's where I found the US, actually. Before even, thinking about coming here, I never knew that I was going to be living here or teaching here. I thought I was going to be in Brazil forever. People still ask me, why is it that you changed Rio for New Jersey?
It's definitely colder.
The landscape's a little bit different. But as I was doing research in what is it that we call trial records, right, of slave rebellions in 19th century Brazil, I came across a slave rebellion that happened in 1864 in the Brazilian province of Minas Gerais, in which many, like 10, 12 enslaved men were being interrogated for, they were being accused of leading this insurrection. And they were giving testimony about the fact that they had been inspired by what they called a war in another country. A war that was happening in another country, but a war that was meant to free all the slaves. And then the more that I read and got into the sources, I understood that they were talking about the US Civil War, and that I had never seen before. That really created a whole set of questions in my mind. And I decided to investigate that. And then after I came here, it just made sense to me that I turned the tables a little bit and tried to share what I learned about Brazil, what I knew about Brazil, with a wider US audience, and to place not only the US Civil War, but the dialogue with the historiography of slavery here in the US and other kind of global phenomena in conversation with the history of Brazil. Was my way of saying, trying to carve out a larger space for Brazil in these conversations about slavery and abolition here. So that's the connection there.
When I picked up your book and started reading, you made an interesting choice in the chronology, because Brazilian slavery doesn't end until the 1880s, but you decided to end in the 1860s already. So what was it why did you pick sort of that chronology? Why did you decide that I want to do this sort of the middle years of the 19th century especially?
So the idea, this was like my my bigger conversation with not only the Latin American historiography of slavery, but with our approaches to abolition, right? So as I studied slave rebellions, I became convinced that I was not studying only like different events or different iterations of manifestations of slave resistance over time. What I could see in what the insurgents were proposing, talking about, thinking about, was that they were engaging and creating a larger tradition of what I call insurgent abolitionism. So the idea, quite frankly, was simple. So Brazil ends slavery only in 1888, right? It's the last country in the Western Hemisphere to end slavery. So enslaved peoples in Brazil see, from Brazil looking outwards, they are seeing the uneven spread of abolition in the Americas. They are especially aware of what is going on in big slave societies like the U.S., but also in Brazil's in Brazil's neighbors like Uruguay, Argentina, other parts of South America. So these are people that are, in many cases, struggling for their freedom in Brazil, where slavery remains strong. But they are seeing this uneven spread of abolition elsewhere. They are seeing the British sometimes act on behalf of abolition or pressure for the abolition of the slave trade elsewhere. So what I noticed is that over time, so much of this insurgent tradition was about their strategic thinking as they read this geopolitical situation, right? Especially in the Americas and its connections with Africa. So the idea of the book was then to trace the development of this insurgent tradition that was conversant with the history of abolition in the Americas. And instead of focusing on the very late 19th century, the 1870s, 1880s is when Brazil passes its first free womb law, the first law to regulate a way out of slavery, gradually thinking about gradual emancipation. This is also the time when the abolitionist movement per se, this interracial movement, a movement that becomes actually Brazil's first national mass political movement in the 1880s. That's when it flourishes and becomes big, resembling what happened in the US. But what I wanted to do is think about abolition from the point of view of enslaved peoples and Maroons especially. And for them, the conversation about abolition as the immediate end of slavery started much before, much earlier than that, right? Usually when we see enslaved peoples in the conversation about the abolitionist movement, they come with a kind of a derivative role. They support, they engage with the work of major abolitionists in the country. I wanted them to kind of speak for themselves and understand their role in helping bring about this issue. And what I saw is that this earlier moment in the history of Brazil, the abolition of the slave trade that just happens in 1850, this is an essential moment for the enslaved. This is when they really understand that, okay, This is a big shift. Africans are no longer coming from the slave trade here. There are conversations about the fact that slavery at some point is gonna end, and then there's the sense of urgency of the imminence of abolition as they also see it being abolished elsewhere. And that's when I see this insurgent tradition kind of picking up. And I wanted to write about that. I wanted to write a history of abolition as this longer Black radical tradition that places importance in the mid 19th century and kind of helps prepare this moment that just comes about in the 1870s and 1880s.
Yeah, that's sort of what, like, it's such an interesting and active period that you're looking at, and I'm looking forward to talk about some of the details and stories you have in the book. But I also wondered, because we have seen a few books now in English in the United States, especially published on Brazil, Brazilian slavery. I'm thinking like Roberto Saba's American Mirror, for example. But like, what I'm going to venture a guess and let you tear me apart on it. It seemed like you are the first one that really does this story of the Brazilian enslaved, from the enslaved people's point of view, because most of them seem to be more about like sort of the white narrative that centers around enslaved, but you're kind of really looking at the enslaved themselves and centers the story around them.
I'm so glad to hear that, because that was my main mission. I think the main thing I wanted to accomplish with this book is that I didn't want. I was a little, we have such a rich tradition in Brazil of writings, of scholarship on slavery. This is probably one of the most vibrant fields in Brazilian scholarship for decades, right?
All right.
And that scholarship is not necessarily, translated into English. Some of it is, right? But the conversation has been really big in Brazil about the fact that, when we think about abolition, it's just not fair to look at enslaved peoples just as the objects of legislation, of state legislation, or objects of, an abolitionist press that wants to free the slaves but doesn't necessarily deal with, larger issues about Black freedom. So what I wanted to understand is like what happens to the narrative, to the official or the well-known narrative of abolition in Brazil, if we take enslaved people seriously as agents of abolitionism. What if abolitionism is not a movement that targets them, but it's is a movement that is also built by them over time? It's not an kind of a reaction, an outburst of outrage in the 1870s or 1880s. It's a movement that builds on a tradition of slave flight, of thinking geopolitically about the prospects of freedom, that is very embedded in the Maroon communities of Brazil, the Quilombos of Brazil, in the rebellions that happened for so many reasons over the 19th century and connect Brazil to larger discussions going on in the Atlantic world. So the idea was, what if we take this seriously and try to look for what U.S. historians usually describe also here as a kind of Black abolitionism. And on that, kind of, this is what the research taught me, because in the beginning, I thought I was writing a work about Anglo-American abolitionism in Brazil. Right? I thought about how is it that Brazil is in conversation with the British and the U.S. history.
Right.
And the more I wrote and read about it, I'm like, what I'm doing here is kind of thinking from, the point of view, like thinking about 19th century history from the point of enslaved peoples in Brazil. What they are doing is building a more diffuse and, nuanced, complicated, but yet still an abolitionist tradition that is very much reliant on insurgency, but not only that. And this is a form of abolitionism. It's on its own right. It has different characteristics. It happens in different places. It's not in the coffee houses. It's not the public sphere that we usually are used to. But yes, there is a public sphere, different one, and this is a kind of, I think, a political movement that we have to take seriously, because it informs not only the history of abolition in Brazil, but our understanding also of the larger international politics, in the 19th century.
Yeah, it was a coffee house. He just took me back to my days of teaching 1688 in British history.
Exactly. These
Uh,
88 moments are complicated.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
exactly. And there's those, like, the coffee house as the emergence of the public sphere argument, after all. But I'm very glad that you kind of said that in Brazil you have sort of this vibrancy, because I think that's the benefit of both of us, because we both speak two languages and English is just one of them, that we have the ability to go into other countries, into other archives, and explore those narratives that oftentimes a US-born US scholar doesn't have, because they don't have that language capability. So, kind of dream scenario, are there any kind of works that you would say that have been published in Brazil that really would be beneficial to have translations of in the US, because they're so groundbreakingly important?
Oh, there are so many.
Oh, sorry.
There are
Maybe
so
just two
there are
or
so
three.
Okay, there are so many. Let me see. There is a very strong scholarship on slavery being produced in Bahia, in Brazil, and this is part of northeast Brazil, which is very interesting because, for many reasons, but because it also deals very deeply with Brazil's ongoing relationship with Africa, right? Salvador, which is the capital of Bahia, still is, but was in the 19th century perhaps the most African city in the Americas, with a large African population, both enslaved and freed, and with ongoing relationships with West Africa and West Central Africa, to the point that we have a whole historiography about not only slavery from these parts of Africa to Brazil, but also communities that return to Africa from Brazil. So I would say, like, there are many, and I think one of the most well-known historians of Brazilian slavery has been translated and writes in English, João José Reis. But there are other works. Not all of his works are in English. But there is a large tradition of studies, people like Vladimir Albuquerque, Walter Fraga, who are historians who write about slavery from Bahia, but that write about abolition in the same kind of vein that you see in my book. It's from them that I am inspired by. And I think other books that really needed to be translated into English are books about the Brazilian quilombos and the Brazilian maroons. We have some, but not the main works, like works from Flávio dos Santos Gomes, who was my advisor in Brazil as well, who wrote major books on the history of quilombos, or a book recently written by Silvia Lara about Palmares, which is the largest, most well-known maroon community in Brazilian history. I think these works would all kind of be beneficial to bring the world up to speed with what is being produced in Brazil.
Yeah, and that's sometimes the the problems that there is this beautiful work out there that just doesn't we don't talk because it's not in a language we speak. But I wanted to kind of ask too, because you already mentioned the Colombos, you also already mentioned sort of slave uprisings, and it's always uncomfortable, I feel, request, but I do want to do it because it's
Mm-hmm.
in U.S. history, we don't have a lot of slave rebellion. We have small like sabotage on the plantation, but we don't have a lot of slave rebellion. Maroonage is by the 19th century hardly existing outside of maybe some areas on the coast of like Georgia and South Carolina or in Florida. So it seems like there are some rather unique features within Brazilian slavery that give slaves more desire to resist or more space to resist. I don't know how to best phrase that.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's both that they're this very large tradition of resistance that they build over time in the country, and they also, bring sometimes from Africa people that enslaved peoples that are being captured in wars in Africa, especially in West Africa, and are being trafficked by the Portuguese and later on by the Brazilians into slavery in Brazil. As long as there was slavery, there was resistance, right?
Right.
But I think what is interesting is perhaps like the ways that scholars deal with and kind of ask questions about this tradition of resistance. I think there's much more in the US than we actually acknowledge.
Okay, let's go
Because
with
we
that.
usually, when the history of rebellion and Maroon communities, historians for a long time were looking for this kind of spectacular events,
Right.
right? Large rebellions with lots of casualties and lots of arrests. And what we see is that, from the point of view of Brazil, that these rebellions sometimes were not these spectacular. Sometimes they were small, but they happen all the time. They are part of a field of, as we say in Brazil, like conflict and negotiation that defines the functioning of slavery. Because slavery cannot function just on the basis of violence. And of course, it is such a violent system, there is not a lot of space for negotiation. But what we see is there's a lot of give and take over time for this system to grow and to stay vibrant for so many centuries, right? So I think what helps, I think, Brazilians understand this history are two things. One is that this understanding of slavery not only as a system, not only as this large-scale labor system that is connected to the slave trade, and then with this large, the numbers of the slave trade and the ships and all that, but an understanding of slavery as lived experience. I think that is very central to Brazilian scholarship. Like, how is it that these people lived? What is it that they thought? How is it that they countered, some of the violence that they saw in their everyday lives, or in other ways? How is it that violence functioned alongside, a very patriarchal system, paternalist system that allowed for some negotiation to happen? So this idea of trying to combine scales in understanding slavery, the large one with the numbers and the structures and the state, but also the kind of microhistory of lived experience, if you want, to really put yourself in in those people's shoes and understand how a society like ours in Brazil is absolutely still structured around the hierarchies and the violences from the time of slavery. And the other thing that I think helps Brazil is that, for example, in the case of the Brazilian Maroons, they are not part of only our past, they are part of our present. Because so many of these communities survived or reinvented themselves over the years that nowadays we have more than 5,000 of them in Brazil. And the last national census in Brazil from 2022, for the first time, counted the population of quilombos, which we call quilombolas, right? People who live in the quilombos of Brazil counted this population for the first time.
Wow.
And it's based on self-declaration, and it's still the numbers are not completely reliable yet. But the census estimated a population of 1.3 million people in the country seeing themselves as quilombolas. And what is important about that is that this population, since Brazil's democratic constitution of 1988, they have the right to ask for land titles. Right, so they are very much part of the current history of Brazil as peoples that are kind of fighting for access to land, and are mobilizing on an ethnic basis. They are part of the conversation as Brazil grapples very slowly with the legacies of slavery. So I think that allows us also to go into the past with different questions and being more open to finding these communities at work, back in colonial times or in the 19th century.
Yeah, no, that's took me back a little bit to my global politics class and the acai farming that we look at, and sort of the issues of human rights, indigenous rights associated
Yes,
with
exactly
that.
that.
Yeah.
Exactly that. Yeah.
But sort of as a follow-up, I also wonder, as you were talking, how much the sort of instability that you have with Brazilian slavery is part of that the slave trade in the South Atlantic is still ongoing, and rather, like I can't think of the numbers right now, but I think it's like 200 to 500,000 people in like the 1850s being brought from Africa to the Americas. It's phenomenal how much trade still goes on in the 1840s and 50s.
Mm-hmm. So that is a very important point, because in the case of Brazil, it takes two laws to abolish officially the slave trade. But what happens is that Brazil has this kind of complicated inheritance from its colonial status with Portugal. It inherited a kind of special relationship with Britain. And so, for example, to recognize Brazilian independence in 1822, the British required that Brazil abolish the slave trade. And that's what started these laws about the slave trade in Brazil. But the country was completely based on slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. So, even though a law was passed in 1831, that's the moment when the slave trade to Brazil peaks to unprecedented levels. It's absolutely insane. So what we have in the 19th century for Brazil is, yes, this is the century of abolition, meaning that, slavery is going to be abolished by the end of it. But this is the century of the peak of the slave trade and the resurgence of slavery in different parts. Slavery moves around a little bit also and tends to concentrate in certain parts of Brazil. But remember, differently from the US, slavery in Brazil is a national institution. It's everywhere. There's no, north and south in that sense. So what we have then is this enormous enslaved population dealing with this very crazy contradiction. They see a pressure for the abolition of the slave trade and abolition of slavery coming from outside. But the slave trade is peaking in Brazil illegally. Most people are coming then in the mid-19th century through contraband to Brazil. And slavery continues to be legal in Brazil. So there's a lot of pressure over this system. And enslaved peoples are very quick to understand the contradiction. And that's how they manage, for example, to resignify what British abolitionism actually means, to imagine that the end of slavery is going to come through a war, that perhaps the British, perhaps the Americans, perhaps the French are going to help the cause of, the slave cause in Brazil, because they are, Brazil's enemies in so to speak, in this conversation about the slave trade. So it's a moment of incredible pressure. And during this little period from like the 30s to the 50s, it's more than 700,000 Africans being trafficked illegally to Brazil. So that creates a human crisis, really, in Brazil that I don't think we have ever recovered from.
Wow, that's a big one. In I mean, you're opening the door already a little bit here towards sort of the international aspects that you have in the book. But before we get there, I have one more thing that I want to talk about with regard to Brazilian slavery in general, and that is that throughout the book, and it's like from start to finish, you talk again and again about how important engagement with print culture is for the enslaved, that they, even if they can't read themselves, they find out what's in the newspapers. And it's this, yes, in U.S. history, I know like that the slaves hear rumors about things, but you also have these laws in place that prohibit you from, and some masters ignore it, in teaching anything like reading and writing to the enslaved. But it seems like there's almost something of a literate culture or a literate body of enslaved in Brazil.
So that's my favorite part of the story, I should confess. And there's something that I learned as I wrote this book. So just to put things in perspective, most of the Brazilian population up to the 1960s was illiterate. We had rates of illiteracy in Brazil like of 60% or thereabouts in the mid 20th century. So if you think about 19th century Brazil, things are, much worse in that sense. We have official rates of literacy for the late 19th century hovering about like 15% of the population, 15% of the entire population. And this is black and white, right? Everybody. But so the reality of Brazil in the 19th century is most of this population doesn't have any access to literacy. And that includes also a lot of white people. So literacy is a privilege of the Brazilian elites in the 19th century. Now, there was no law forbidding planters or whoever to teach slaves how to read and write, but it was a criminalized practice nonetheless, right? The planters they really criminalized slave literacy. They didn't want anybody to learn how to read and write. And this was not, planters were Catholic. And Catholics didn't have this tradition of, like we see here in the U.S., of this Protestant tradition of emphasizing the literacy for the reading of the Bible and things like that. No, religion is mediated by, the priest figure in Catholicism. So that was not even a deal in Brazil. So having all that context in mind, I go to the archives and I find these many instances of enslaved peoples talking about what is going on in the world because they and that's what I usually found. They heard through the newspapers. It's like this conflation of oral and written all the time. Or they heard someone say, or someone that was literate said. So what I realized over time is that there was a whole world that I could not see because I was understanding literacy as this ability to read and write, as a kind of a set of skills that you have to acquire. So you become literate like, the poets or the political class in Brazil at that time. And when I started to understand literacy on a spectrum, then things changed quite a lot. Because what I understood is that very few slaves could actually read and write. Some of them could read. Some of them could read and write badly. Some of them could look at the newspapers and understand the headlines. Some of them could actually read the small print. Some of them understood this manuscript culture that was the reality in 19th century Brazil. Others didn't, but they functioned in a society organized around writing. And they found ways. So what was very common is that literacy for enslaved peoples was collaborative. So meaning, for example, they couldn't write letters, but they dictated letters to other people to write. They couldn't write the newspapers, but as you see, like the cover of my book is exactly that dynamic, right? The idea that if you have one person that can actually read the newspaper, this person will read it out loud. And we will invite all these people that don't have access to literacy to participate in a written culture that they see as theirs as well. So what I found in the book is that word about events, in Brazil, like, for example, laws that were being passed to abolish the slave trade or eventually to abolish slavery, or word about the many wars in which Brazil was kind of aware of during the 1860s. This came to the slaves through the press many times. But it's a different kind of access to print culture than the one we are familiar with. So actually, this is the topic of the next book that I'm writing. I want to just devote my attention to literacy, to Black literacy in 19th century Brazil, because there's much more to understand and uncover. But this was a very important part of their insurgent tradition in the 19th century.
Yeah, that's just fascinating in so many ways that you can think in terms of like, it just takes one small piece of news to kind of let the minds and the oral communication takes that in so many different directions, right?
And the word spreads like fire. It's incredible. It's incredible. The parts of Brazil where I found this dynamic, like in the middle of the Amazon, or in landlocked provinces that are very far away from this Atlantic world that we imagine for the 19th century. So really, there's these networks of communication are very, very vibrant everywhere.
Well, now I got to ask, how did you find it? Because that seems like
they found me, I guess. So it all started with that document that I mentioned in the beginning, that the court trials of this rebellion in which enslaved peoples were talking about the papers. And they, it was not a metaphor. They were saying this guy read in the papers that the Brazilian parliament was passing a law to abolish slavery, and also that there was this war for the freedom of slaves in another country. Basically, it's time for us to rise up. And they met repeatedly, and in all their testimonies, there is this talk about, yes, because it was in the papers, because the newspaper said that. They published these ideas. So for them, it's a measure also of kind of this... for them, the imminence of emancipation was written into, print culture, because the written word had such authority for them. And when I saw that dynamic in this rebellion, I started to look in others and pay attention to this, because sometimes it's a little snippet of information, sometimes it's a sentence. But the more you try to find it, the more you start putting this together. And it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's fascinating where, like, in the most unexpected places, you find that
very
little
unexpected
bit of information that then completely has to you changing your opinion about like how information is communicated. And then also kind of just thinking in terms of like what you just said, that it probably didn't say what the enslaved later believed it said, but they kind of interpreted into it all those things that they hoped this would do.
Yeah, so part of it was also taking oral culture seriously and taking rumor very seriously, right?
Yeah.
Because most of the sources I have, they criminalize or they dismiss rumor, oh,
Yeah.
these are the fantastic ideas that the slaves
Mm-hmm.
are coming up with, or they are so,
Mm.
it's all based on these racist views of the
Right.
enslaved. Oh, they are so ignorant. They are, misunderstanding the international scenario, or they think that this law is going to free them.
Mm.
Yes, they do, and they risk their lives
Yeah.
because they do believe this law is going to free them.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started to kind of work more against the narrative of my sources and take things
Mm.
seriously, then I started to find a different story about abolition.
Mm. Yeah. It's sometimes interesting when you kind of do that you say like, ooh, maybe there's truth to what they're saying.
Hmm.
How things change.
Yeah.
Uh, let me see here. We have already covered so much ground in all of this. So I guess it's
Right.
about time that we bring the British in here, the daftly British that I had at my home,
I'm
I
so glad
suppose.
we didn't bring them first. Let
No,
them stay in the
yeah, no.
background.
Yeah, we'll give the Confederates at some point a little bit of a side, but we don't need to
All
get
right,
there
we'll leave
yet.
them for last.
But as you already said, Brazil and the British have a really interesting relationship in that the British have a lot of influence, and I would almost want to argue that an overblown influence in Brazilian affairs,
Oh, yeah.
for considering that Brazil is not a small, little, weak tribal nation in the heart of Africa. This is a pretty big power, and the British seem to have
Hmm.
a lot of influence on affairs.
They do. So, what happens? The British are not only the main kind of political influence over Brazil, but they are also Brazil's largest commercial partner, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there are many links between the two countries. Nowadays, when we think of Latin America, we are so used to thinking about US influence, right, over especially
Mm-hmm.
South America. But in the 19th century was not yet like that, and the
Mm-hmm.
British were the ones that were kind of very important in the history of
Mm-hmm.
many of these
Mm-hmm.
of these countries of South America. So in the case of Brazil, especially with with the Brazilian independence from Portugal and its kind of links, then these promises of abolishing the slave trade, Brazil then was in a very tough position during the whole century because the Brazilian political class was made up of slaveholders, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
that slavery was happening in the country and it was one of the many, labor systems in the country. Yes, there was some free labor in the country. There was indentured, there was immigration, from Europe also already in the mid 19th
Mm-hmm.
century. But slavery was supreme, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak. And the political classes of Brazil were, they were slaveholders. The emperor had slaves.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholic Church had slaves. Everybody had slaves in Brazil. And slavery was so widespread that it was not a phenomenon only in the big plantations, coffee,
Mm-hmm.
tobacco, sugar plantations. It was in urban life. It was
Mm-hmm.
everywhere in Brazil. And a lot of people owned like one or two slaves
Mm-hmm.
in cities in Brazil and lived off of their work.
Mm-hmm.
So this institution was really pervasive
Mm-hmm.
in Brazilian life. So when Brazil politically, diplomatically, Brazil started then to suffer this pressure
Mm-hmm.
from the British to abolish the slave trade, as the British kind of extract themselves from the
Mm-hmm.
slave trade in 1808. And then the largest slave traders in the world were the Portuguese and the
Mm-hmm.
Brazilians. So that's why Brazil is in a tough position. And that's what the enslaved see.
Mm-hmm.
What they see is that in the conversations, among their masters, the British often show up as the main enemy because they are the ones spreading these dangerous ideas about freedom or the end of the trade and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So they understand that and they imagine that maybe the British could be allies, in their
Mm-hmm.
fight for freedom.
Right.
But they are also very aware that the British owned
Mm-hmm.
a lot of slaves in Brazil. British
Mm-hmm.
people also had slaves in Brazil. They owned, the major gold mines in the country.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a complicated, very nuanced relationship, but it becomes a point of reference for enslaved peoples,
Mm-hmm.
that they know that the elites fear the British, the slaveholding elites fear the British in Brazil, and they develop strategies from that.
Mm-hmm. How's like I'm just thinking here, British emancipation in the 1830s, does that have any impact on like the way Brazilian enslaved think about like the end of slavery is near, or is it really sort of the British naval
Sorry,
engagement?
can you repeat that? I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, no, of course. So by the 1830s, when Britain abolishes slavery, is that having an impact
Mhm.
on like the thinking of the enslaved in Brazil to say, "Oh, the end is near. We're gonna be free soon, free soon too," or is it more the British gunboat diplomacy in the after the restarting of the slave trades that has more of that impact?
Mhm. From what I see, it's more the gunboat diplomacy, because
Okay, all right.
what
Yeah.
the enslaved peoples really pay attention to is the presence of the Royal Navy in Brazilian waters
Okay.
and
Yeah.
on the Atlantic,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they are there, and their presence becomes really conspicuous in the
Mm-hmm.
1840s, in the 1850s, the
Mm-hmm.
1860s. I describe in the book the biggest crisis that happened between Brazil and Britain happened in 1860, the end of 1862, when
Mm-hmm.
the Royal Navy actually laid siege to the port of Rio de Janeiro, which was the capital of Brazil back then. And then people in Brazil, not only the enslaved, everybody
Mm-hmm.
thought, okay, now Brazil is going to go into war with Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And it was called the Christie Affair because William Christie was the ambassador, the British ambassador in Brazil, and he was the one coordinating all these efforts. But we see, for example, in 1862 and 1863, a lot of rebellions happening in Brazil because people, hear and see, right, the Royal Navy in Brazil, and they imagine that perhaps the British are coming to Brazil to liberate the slaves. So it's less abolition in the Caribbean in the 30s. I see more influence on Brazil from French abolition in 1848. That's what people are mostly talking about.
So we talked about you mentioned the Christie affairs there in sort of relation to 1860, 62, 63. And I guess associated with that is also the maybe explain a little bit the I hope I get this pronunciation right. Africano Libra?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Who are they?
So that's very important actually in the story,
Yes.
because what happens, this is not only happens in Brazil, but it's part of how the British set up an anti-slave trade kind of campaign all over the
Mm-hmm.
Atlantic. So the British assigned themselves the power to intervene in the slave trade. So it set up many different treaties with, different countries. In the case of Brazil, in these negotiations in the 1820s. But really early on, still when Brazil was a Portuguese colony, and since 1815, they were already talking about forbidding the trade above the equator. So Brazil
Mm-hmm.
was not supposed to trade, for example, with the west coast, the Mina coast, the west coast of Africa, which was one of the main places
Mm-hmm.
enslaved Africans came from. And then in the 1820s, in the 1830s, things escalated even more. And what happened was that uh, the the British then patrolled, right, the Atlantic, and it had the right to seize ships involved or suspected of slave trading illegally, right, to be involved in the illegal slave trade with parts of Africa. So whenever the British, or even later on, the Brazilians also got involved into that because the British installed a mixed commission in Brazil. What happened was that once these ships were seized, then there was a trial. The trial usually took place in places like the Cape Colony or the island of Saint Helena, some Helena, I guess in English. And what happened was that the Africans that were seized on the ship were then emancipated by the British, and they were emancipated, but they were not absolutely freed. They were emancipated on the condition of fulfilling periods of apprenticeship. Right, it's kind of they had two certificates of emancipation, one when the ship was seized and another one after completing this period of apprenticeship. That in the case of Brazil was a period of 14 years. So very long period of apprenticeship. And the idea is that you are only freed then, like a free person, after that. So Africans were, during this period, they were assigned to either what we call private hires, or people that would employ them in different kinds of work, or they would work in public works in Brazil. And this is, in Brazil, these emancipated Africans that are usually called in the British world liberated Africans. In Portuguese, they were called emancipados or africanos livres. In Cuba, they also called them emancipados. So these were, in the end, since this process started very early on in the 19th century, in the case of Brazil, these are the first group of Africans that are experiencing some degree of emancipation, right, in Brazil. It's Brazil's first experience with emancipation, which is a very tragic one, because what happens to these people is that mostly they are in slavery-like conditions during apprenticeship, and they not always get their freedom in the end. And in the case of Brazil, there's a very specific feature, which is that the Brazilian law requires that when Africans complete this period of apprenticeship, they are supposed to go back to Africa. So there's a deportation clause attached to that, right? It doesn't necessarily happen because the Brazilian government never sets up a scheme to kind of, send people back to Africa. They actually expect the Africanos Livres to save up money to pay their way back to Africa, which is like, doesn't work, obviously. And like self-deport. That doesn't happen. But that creates a kind of, a human crisis, really, because these people are supposed to be on their way to emancipation, but that doesn't necessarily happen. So that they are very much part of the story, because in my view, they are the beginning of this insurgent tradition that leads to abolition, right? They are a part of it, very important part of it.
Well, that's how they then, excuse me, that's how they then look at the British and say, when there's a British worship in town or there's a British consulate in town, if they're mistreated, that's the place where they can seek refuge and support.
That's how this idea spreads, right? That perhaps if there's abuse, masters abuse, then they run to British consulates, they run to British ships, but they also run to U.S. ships. They run to French ships. That depends on what is going on. In the 19th century, they kind of connect their freedom to these different conflicts going on elsewhere.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think of because sometimes that is like somebody today who is seeking like refugee status, right? Like, was it Snowden who went into the Bolivian embassy in London to kind of escape prosecution and extradition? Like, we think of that as a modern phenomenon,
I think
but
it was the Ecuadorian.
yes, it's
Wasn't it
Ecuador.
Ecuador?
Sorry,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But it's like they're doing that in the 19th century, right?
They are.
This sort of
Yeah.
understanding that if I go to the British, they hopefully will protect me, and they have the military power to actually enforce that protection.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things is that at least by, running away to a British consulate, sometimes they made sure that the Brazilian police would open an investigation into the case.
Right.
And that sometimes was enough, right? They just wanted it to be, to become an issue. Like they wanted to seek some kind of mediation, and that often worked. Right.
Yeah.
But sometimes it got a little complicated because sometimes they ran away to Confederate ships. Not always, running to freedom.
Right. But I think associated with what we are talking about here and that you have in the book is that we usually think of emancipation as a very domestic affair, right? Whether that is in Peru during the Civil Wars, the emancipation in the 50s, in the US, in the 1860s, or wherever we want to draw it with Cuba, and whether it's the 10 Years' War as the starter, and then the end eventually it was in the... But it seems Brazil that this conversation is from the start a very international one, that slaves almost look and desire some outside assistance to help with the end of slavery.
Well, I think that's an important point because it's perhaps still the case, but less so now. But for so many decades, we historians of slavery have looked at abolition within the boundaries of different nation states, right? Thinking about abolition as this process that is focused on the state, on the laws that are passed to eventually, abolish slavery, or looking at different national abolitionist movements and their interaction with the state and the law. And of course, that's part of the story, right? But slavery was never only a national institution. And that's the point that I try to make with the book, that if you think from the point of view of enslaved peoples, and if you are thinking seriously about the Black experience in the 19th century, this is a transnational institution. Their experiences are transnational. In the case of Brazil and Cuba, so many of the enslaved population and the free population over the 19th century is still African born, right? And even in the case of the U.S., the same thing, because for enslaved peoples, most times what was important was not necessarily the boundaries of different states, because we see them as very stable, retrospectively, but they were not stable back then. They're still not stable right now, as we can clearly see. But they were thinking about the world mostly in terms of spaces with slavery and free and spaces of free soil, right? They were trying to figure out how is it that free soil was spreading, where is it that they had to run away to, what was the logic of abolition. And so much of abolition has to do with international relations. Right, with, there's the British, but there's also this conversation within the Americas and within South America. For example, Brazil stands out in the 19th century as this constitutional monarchy surrounded by a bunch of republics that start the process of abolishing slavery in the 1810s. It's a complicated process that takes many decades to actually happen. So abolition in other countries of South America, the timeline is not that different from the one in Brazil. But that's the reality, right? Brazil is this monarchy surrounded by republics. These countries already have laws to regulate gradual emancipation. it is, it sees the US as a mirror because it's the largest, slave society in the Americas, and it sees what is going on. And especially Brazil has in mind the both the enslaved and the political classes of Brazil have Haiti in mind. This is the big in the geopolitics of slavery, right? So yeah, not so much. I think we miss a lot of stuff if we don't look to the experience of enslaved peoples in this transnational sense. But I want to make clear that for slave resistance to happen, slavery was enough. You don't need anything from abroad. Your experience with the brutality of slavery was enough. But it was more than that, right? And I try to see enslaved peoples as not only people who are surviving this system, but are also thinking about it, and are also trying to leave their imprint in this 19th century history.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think we'll get back to the transnational and sort of boundaries in a minute. But before we do, I want to briefly kind of think of the transnational nature of sort of ideas here a little bit, because you said earlier that one of the things that Brazil very much is thinking about is sort of that once that individual freed from the slave trade finishes the apprenticeship, they're supposed to self-deport. And obviously the destination for that is Africa, which is not dissimilar to the idea of colonization that people in the United States have, where it's like you get your manumission or your freedom and please leave. So what's the transnational underpinning of this? Is this just that, because in the US it's always the argument that, oh, it's a white man's republic, non-white people don't fit, but that doesn't work in Brazil.
It's a white man's monarchy in Brazil.
Exactly.
It's the idea is that the government sees Africans as a threat, right? There's always that kind of slaveholder mentality that slavery is a case of internal war, that slaves are enemies of masters, and they are dangerous. They are always conspiring and to overthrow the system. The Brazilian slaveholding class is very worried that another Haitian revolution can happen in Brazil. They always have that tragedy in mind in their words. So and they look up to Europe, especially to France, as an ideal of civilization. Right?
I don't feel like that's a good one, but okay.
Yeah. Oh, France is the measure, and the emperor writes his correspondence in French. It's a very kind of francophone world of these elites, but they are really concerned about issues that they see as of national security, and they articulate quite clearly as a way to de-Africanize Brazil. They want to de-Africanize the population, right? And this is coupled with the first attempts of the Brazilian state and also of private individuals also to bring immigrants from Europe. So we are talking about Switzerland, Germany, in some cases Italy and Portugal, but mostly, white immigrants that cater to this kind of ideals of whitening that are developing in the 19th century. And they're going to become the state ideology by the end of the 19th century. So there's this is the idea that you de-Africanize Brazil, you send people back, and that you kind of prepare the country for what the elites see as an eventual transition from slavery into free labor, right? And that's part of this larger conversation that is happening in Brazil since, at least the 1830s.
Right. And I'm going to real quick look at if I can find it. You mentioned a plantation or mining area in the south,
in São Paulo,
western, yeah, and like it. And I seem to remember, I didn't write it down, but there was sort of, we had the enslaved population on one hand, and then I want to say it was a German immigrant population that worked there. So that you had
German and Swiss, yeah.
this combination of these two labor systems: the free labor system, the enslaved labor system, and the kind of the tenuous relationships between those existing there.
Yeah, in that part of the book, I was trying to think about the possibility of talking about a kind of subaltern form of abolitionism, different imaginings of abolition, because there's in this coffee plantation in São Paulo, Ibicaba, it was called, in the 1850s. They start experimenting with what they see as free labor, what we would see as indentured labor. But they bring immigrants from the Swiss cantons at the time, and from also parts of what is Germany today, to work on the coffee fields. But these are slave plantations, right? Coffee is being produced by slaves, but they create alongside this slave plantation, they create what they call a colony. And these immigrants come; they have a contract with the owner, with the plantation owner, and the idea is that the plantation owner is going to finance their trip to Brazil. And with their work, they're going to pay him back eventually, work alongside slaves, but, live in their own colony with their families. So in this plantation, we have this case in which we have the enslaved on one side, and on the other side, this colony called the Senador Vergueiro colony. And what is interesting is that over time, it becomes clear that there's a lot of abuse with the people that we call the colonos, the immigrants, right? Their contracts are not honored. They are working, in very bad conditions. They are indebted to, for life, almost sometimes, to this plantation. And this idea that they would be working on one side and enslaved peoples would be on the other side is not really feasible.
No.
So these people meet each other all the time.
Right.
And what happens is that they exchange ideas. And what is interesting to see is that at some point they are, having conversations about this world of abolitionism. And the Swiss and the German also think that maybe the British are the ones who are going to come and lend in a hand, because they are the ones talking about free labor. They are the ones talking about the end of the slave trade. However, there's a clear racial divide still, right? With the European immigrants looking down on the slaves. So there's this divide. There's very, very clearly articulated by them. But in 1856, the Swiss rebel in this plantation, and the enslaved, are privy to everything, their conversations and everything that is going on. And they also have rebellion plans alongside the Swiss.
Right.
Brazilian history just saw the immigrant rebellion, right? As it's considered the biggest immigrant rebellion in the 19th century. But it didn't consider what was happening on the minds of enslaved peoples at this time, at the same time. And what we can see is that they read what the Swiss were asking for in their own way. So they are thinking about running away. They are thinking about creating their own free states. They are kind of partaking in the same kinds of conversations. And the idea of the book is to understand the tensions and the differences between them, but to try to understand this world of forced labor in a larger way, and understand that different kinds of workers were having conversations that were all about abolition at this time.
And I think one of the fascinating parts that you have, and I think it's in the later chapters of the book, where you talk about that we shouldn't think of these rebellions as moments, but as processes. That this is not like, oh, it happens for 2 weeks and then it's over, but it maybe the tip of the iceberg is 2 weeks, but then there's so much, they continue so much longer on.
Yeah, because that's what the authorities would like us to believe, that they are short-lived. That's why what you see in the sources. Oh yeah, it's been repressed. Everybody's been arrested, and then and then people are being tortured in police stations, and it's a whole repression effort. And that's what you get in the sources. The description of the repression as if it's dealt with. This is over. But if you go see, sometimes a rebellion is just the moment of creation of a new maroon community. People rebel, run away from a plantation, and form a different settlement elsewhere. Or they rebel this year, next year they rebel again, and the other year they rebel again. So there's a reason why you see rebellions happening in the same place, because that kind of,
It's almost a
the
tradition
issues
by
don't
that
disappear.
stage.
Yeah. So I think just like abolition is not an event, it's a long process, I think we should see rebellions in the same ways, right? They are complicated political processes that last much more than the Brazilian state would like us to believe.
Yeah, agreed. And I think at this stage, it's time to bring in one other country that we should talk about, and it's not the United States, it's Paraguay,
Oh no!
I think.
Oh, Paraguay.
Right? Because I think when we look at your book, yes, you have, now I'm blanking, I think it's 2 chapters on sort of the U.S. relationships and Confederate raiders, and as much as I love to talk about Bahia, I do want to get to an end soon at some point too, but I think if I read the book right, the Triple Alliance War or Paraguayan War, however you want to, whatever term we want to give it, had a phenomenal impact on
Yes.
the way the Brazilian state is rethinking that issue of the enslaved.
So maybe we can put the two of them in conversation, the U.S. Civil War and the Triple Alliance War, because
Sure.
you
I let you take
all
that.
know that the U.S. Civil War is like 1861 to 65, the official timeline. Then the Triple Alliance War is 64 to 1870. So they don't necessarily overlap, but they a little bit. But in the Brazilian historiography, the conversation was usually that it is the U.S. Civil War and seeing emancipation in the United States is what leads the Brazilian government, the emperor, to first consider regulating a way out of slavery. He decides that he needs to bring the issue of gradual emancipation to the attention of the parliament, and he actually does that. That's true. In 1864, he talks about the Civil War, and he tells Parliament, listen, we don't want to see what the British did to us happen again. And we don't also want, he didn't say with these words, but what the message is, we don't want slavery here to end up with a civil war like in the United States. We got to see what we are going to do. But as he says that, then the Triple Alliance War breaks out. And then there is this, all the conversation about the gradual emancipation in Brazil comes to a halt because the country is at war. And this conversation is going to come back in the 1870s. So historians usually, studied the Civil War for this kind of political impact, and then said, okay, but then after the Triple Alliance War, that's when Brazil really has to deal with the issue of slavery, not only because of the war itself, but because the war demands that Brazil recruit some freed people into the army, right? And that creates a whole chaos in the country. I'm not disputing any of that. It's just that if you look on the ground to what is happening to enslaved peoples in the 1860s, what they see is a little bit different. They see that first Brazil almost went to war with Britain in 1862, 1863. Then there is this war in the United States that is a really complicated issue, and that gets to Brazil because both Union and Confederate ships, cruisers, come to the coast of Brazil, and everybody knows that this war is going on. And then when you thought that things were over, you get the Triple Alliance War. So for them, it's kind of a crescendo of of war.
Right.
And the issue with the Triple Alliance War is that I don't think people usually study it in the US, but this is the first case of total war in South America. This is an enormous war. It decimates the population of Paraguay. So it is Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina against Paraguay. And what happens is that it's really genocide. What happens, and Brazil is very much complicit in it, because almost, 80 to 90% of the Paraguayan male population perished during the war. There's a huge massacre of Guarani and indigenous peoples in Paraguay. So it is a huge deal in Latin American history. Like, just like in the United States, your war heroes, the name of your streets, like, come from the US Civil War. For us in Brazil, it's all about the Triple Alliance War. So, but from the point of view of the enslaved, I always, my idea in the beginning was to stop with the Civil War, because I thought, there's enough war in this book. The Triple Alliance War is a whole can of worms. Like, I'm going to have to
do it. Yeah.
But then I realized, and in conversation also with my colleagues, that, this conversation about abolition has to be rooted also in the history of Latin America. I don't want people to get the impression that it's all coming, from the North Atlantic. The Brazil's fragile borders with other countries in South America were the places where abolition was being fought too and was being decided. So the idea, it was to show, and I wanted to do something different. Instead of talking about the recruitment of freedmen into the army, I wanted to talk about what happens to those who stay behind. What happens to enslaved peoples that don't go into the battlefront, or what happens to the home front in Brazil as the country, turns to Paraguay. And what I realized is that that's the moment when marronage in Brazil escalates, because Brazil didn't have a national army up to then. It had to create it all of a sudden to fight the war against Paraguay. And what happens is that they have to call everybody, the National Guard, the police, anybody. They do forced recruitment. They do everything they can to have enough men to fight in the war. And in this vacuum of policing, of surveillance that happens in parts of the country as people leave, then the enslaved kind of see an opportunity to run away, to rebel. And what we see is really the escalation of Black activism in the late 1860s in Brazil. That's what the story I wanted to tell in the book.
Yeah, and that was exactly where I kind of was wanting to go to as well, that the kind of emergence of that national crisis that takes away the policing bodies that any type of slavery always relies on. That if there's no policing of the enslaved, that underpins the authority of the masters, slavery is going to crumble, and at least on the edges.
Yeah. And there's a huge crisis also because Brazil is very careful in this recruitment of freed people. They never recruit slaves into the armed forces. They ask slave masters to free their slaves and then sign them up as freed people in the army. So, and these slaveholders are compensated by the state. So it is a kind of very conservative way, the most conservative there is, of kind of recruiting Black people into the army. But even if this is the process, and we are talking here about, I think, around 7,000 Black soldiers that went to the war. It's not a lot compared, to the size of the Brazilian army. Sure. But what happens is that it has effects over the whole enslaved population. And you also have enslaved people fleeing to join the army, just like in the US, right? Thinking that if they do so, they're going to be freed. Or they run away and they say that they are free and therefore they should be recruited. And the chaos of war, sometimes they get their freedom this way.
I seem to remember that after the wars, the army becomes one of the kernels for emancipation, correct?
And then, that's, the Triple Alliance War is the time when the Brazilian army comes into being. And after that, then when we go back to the post-war moment, then they want to have a bigger say in this country. They see that they won the war. So they want to have a bigger political role in this monarchy that is very centralized around the figure of the emperor.
Yeah. It's definitely again, it's a really fascinating stories that you have there. At this stage, I think I'm hearing my name being called slowly
Oh yeah, I
to
do
go
too.
to
You
deal
should
with
go for it.
bedtime. But it was a great pleasure, and thank you so much for taking so much time out of your day to talk about your really fascinating book. And we only really scratched the surface for those who are listening. So thank you so much. And if you're interested in the book, it is Freedom's Horizon: Black Abolitionism in 19th Century Brazil.
Yeah, thank you so much for reading the book so carefully and for your questions. I'm so happy that we got to talk a lot about Brazil and in its kind of global context, but to perhaps my hope is that the history of Brazil, Brazil can be a lens for other people to look at other parts of the world, because so many different questions come from engaging with this history that sometimes sounds like fiction, but no, that's what we that's what we have going on over there. But that historically the U.S. and Brazil have been mirrors to each other, and in many ways. And the book tries to explore a different tradition, right? A tradition of kind of engaging with the U.S. history from an insurgent practice and thinking. And I hope that inspires new questions also about U.S. history. Thank you for having me.
I hope so. Well, thank you. And I hope that people will find a lot of interesting stories in your book when they read it.
All right.
So I